The Texas sun blazed overhead like an angry god as Captain Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the Greyhound bus, her duffel bag landing hard on the cracked asphalt beside her. Fort Rucker, Alabama. The flight training facility stretched before her like a monument to everything she'd ever wanted and everything everyone had told her she couldn't have. She inhaled deeply, the humid air thick with aviation fuel and possibility. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the worn canvas of her bag, not from fear, but from the weight of expectation she carried like an invisible anchor. It was August 1998, just 5 years after the combat exclusion law had changed, opening the skies to female pilots in the United States military. Sarah was part of the first true generation of women who could dream of piloting the AH-64 Apache attack helicopter, the most lethal, sophisticated, and coveted aircraft in Army aviation. She'd spent her entire childhood in a small town outside Austin, Texas, watching movies like Top Gun and dreaming of soaring above clouds. But unlike most children who grew out of such fantasies, Sarah had never let hers go. The dream had a specific face, her twin brother Marcus. She could still see him at age 8, building model airplanes in their bedroom while she sketched helicopter designs on notebook margins during math class. Marcus had always been the one their parents called naturally gifted. He moved through life with an easiness Sarah envied, but it was Sarah who stayed up until midnight studying aviation manuals. It was Sarah who memorized every technical specification of combat helicopters. It was Sarah who turned her childhood obsession into unshakable determination. Everything changed on February 28, 1991. Operation Desert Shield. Marcus, now Lieutenant Marcus Mitchell, piloted a reconnaissance helicopter over the Iraqi border. He never came home. The military called it a mechanical failure. Sarah called it a thief, one that stole her brother and left her with a void shaped like wings. For 3 years after his death, she'd wandered through life like a ghost, attending college without passion, working jobs without purpose. Her parents worried she'd never recover. Her mother suggested therapy. Her father quietly suggested she move on. Then she saw the news article about women being allowed into combat aviation roles. Something ancient awakened inside her chest. It wasn't grief anymore. It was fire. "You'll need to prove yourself 3 times over," her commanding officer, Major Henderson, had warned her just this morning during their briefing. He was a man in his 50s with a permanent squint and the kind of voice that came from 100 cigarettes smoked in anger. The other pilots aren't ready for this experiment, and frankly, neither am I. Sarah had met his gaze steadily. "I'm not here to convince anyone, sir. I'm here to fly." He'd laughed, a harsh barking sound that held no humor. That's what they all say. Now standing in the oppressive Alabama heat, she watched the instructors gathered near the hangar. There were 12 of them, all men, all with the kind of weathered faces and tight jaws that came from years of military service. As she approached, their conversation died. She could feel their eyes on her like physical pressure against her skin, assessing, skeptical, hostile. "Mitchell," one of them called out, a grizzled instructor with captain's bars. "You're in my ground school class. I'm Captain Williams. Don't expect special treatment because of what you are. You'll get the same expectations as every other pilot candidate, which means if you can't hack it, you'll wash out like the others before you." Sarah nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir, I understand." "Do you?" Williams stepped closer, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear. "There were 2 women before you who tried Apache training. One couldn't handle the pressure and quit after 4 weeks. The other washed out because she couldn't execute the combat maneuvers. You see where I'm going with this?" "I see, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the ice crystallizing in her stomach. "Those were different women." Williams studied her for a long moment. "We'll see about that." That evening, Sarah sat in her temporary quarters, a small room in the transient officer housing, and pulled out the worn leather journal she'd kept since age 12. The pages were filled with sketches of helicopters, technical notes, mission strategies. She flipped to a page she'd written 8 years ago in Marcus's handwriting. Sarah will fly higher than any of us. She has the will to do it. Her brother had always believed in her. He'd been the gifted one, the natural talent, yet he'd still recognized something fierce in his twin sister. That recognition had become her religion. On the worst days, when doubt crept in like smoke, she would read his words and remember. This wasn't just about her anymore. The first week of ground school was intellectual warfare. Captain Williams and his staff loaded the candidates with complex systems information, navigation theory, and mechanical engineering concepts. Most of the men she trained with were competent, some brilliant. But Sarah was different. She approached every problem like it was a puzzle designed specifically for her to solve. While others studied, she visualized, seeing the helicopter's systems as a living organism, understanding not just the what but the why. By Friday, she'd scored 98 on the mechanical systems exam. The second highest score belonged to a fighter pilot named Lieutenant Brooks, who'd gotten 94. Sarah watched from her seat as Captain Williams announced the results, saw how his jaw tightened when he read her name at the top of the list. During lunch, the other candidates treated her differently. Some avoided her entirely, clustering in groups that whispered when she passed. Others seemed curious, asking her how she'd studied, what preparation she'd done. One pilot, a friendly guy named Rodriguez, even sat down next to her. "That was impressive, Mitchell. Seriously, you nailed that exam." "Thanks," Sarah said, meaning it. "You know what they're saying?" Rodriguez asked quietly. "Some of the guys think you're some kind of computer or something, like you don't have emotions, just data and calculations." Sarah smiled despite herself. "That's fine, let them think that." But that night, alone in her quarters, she cried for the first time since arriving at Rucker. Not from despair, but from the sheer pressure of being watched constantly, of knowing that every mistake would be dissected and used as evidence that women didn't belong in the cockpit. Every success had to be explained as luck or obsession rather than simple competence. She wrote a letter to Marcus, as she often did, though she never mailed them. "I'm here, Marcus. I'm doing this. They don't think I belong, but I'm going to make them see. I'm going to fly higher than you ever did. I'm going to make every barrier I break into a bridge for someone else to cross. That's my mission now, not just flying, but opening doors. Wait for me among the clouds, brother. I'm coming home." Sarah sealed the letter in her journal, set her alarm for 4 in the morning, and prepared for another day of proving the impossible was simply the inevitable they weren't ready for. The month of September blurred into October as Sarah moved through ground school like a force of nature. While other candidates struggled with the relentless curriculum, she thrived. Every night, she studied until her eyes burned. Every morning, she was the first in the classroom. Captain Williams had begun calling on her deliberately during lectures, perhaps testing whether her first exam success was a fluke. Each time, she answered with precision. By mid-October, the pattern was undeniable. Sarah Mitchell was among the top performers in her class. On the day of the final written examination, a grueling 8-hour marathon of technical knowledge, navigation theory, emergency procedures, and tactical scenarios, Sarah moved through the test room like a surgeon, methodical and precise. When she finished early, as she always did, Captain Williams barely glanced at her as she submitted her work. But she caught the tightness around his mouth, the way his jaw clenched as he accepted the test packet. The unofficial scores circulated through the officer quarters within hours. Sarah had scored 99 out of 100, the highest score in the entire class. Rodriguez found her in the dining hall that evening and actually cheered when he sat down next to her. "Mitchell, you crushed it. 99. That's insane. Who gets a 99? "I missed one question," Sarah said, dissecting a piece of chicken she had no appetite for. "Something about hydraulic systems in extreme cold. I second-guessed myself." "Are you serious?" Rodriguez laughed. "You're worried about 1 point. I got an 87. Half the class didn't break 85. You're going to get whatever assignment you want." If only he knew. Assignment day arrived like an executioner's dawn. All 60 candidates gathered in the auditorium, dress uniforms pressed, shoes polished to mirror shine. The commanding officer, Colonel Bancroft, stood at the podium with a thick manila folder. He was a thin man with silver threading through his dark hair, someone who'd made general rank before 35 and never lost his hunger. He explained the assignment process methodically. Top scorers had first choice, and assignments were made based on demonstrated capabilities, test performance, and the needs of the Army aviation community. "When I call your name," Bancroft announced, "you'll come forward to receive your assignment packet. Congratulations on completing ground school. You've earned the privilege of beginning your specific aircraft training. This is when the real work begins." One by one, names were called. Rodriguez, Apache; Thompson, Apache; Jackson, Chinook Transport; Chen, Black Hawk. The assignments fell like dominoes, and with each one, Sarah's hope rose. She'd earned the highest score. She'd aced every evaluation. She'd proven herself over and over again. When Colonel Bancroft reached the M's in alphabetical order, her heart began to thunder in her chest. "Mitchell, Captain Sarah." She stood, straightening her uniform jacket, and walked to the podium. Bancroft handed her the envelope without meeting her eyes. That small gesture, that avoided gaze, was the first sign something was wrong. Sarah's hands felt distant as she opened the envelope, as if they belonged to someone else. "Captain Sarah Mitchell, assignment, A-60A Black Hawk Transport Squadron." The words didn't make sense. Her mind rejected them like a body rejects a transplanted organ. Black Hawk, transport. These were logistics helicopters, important for supply runs and personnel movement, but they weren't combat aircraft. They weren't what she'd trained for. They weren't what she'd earned. She looked up at Bancroft, and for just a moment she saw something flicker across his face. Not cruelty, but something harder to identify. Resignation, maybe, or pity. "Congratulations, Captain," he said formally. "You'll begin your A-60 track next week." Sarah walked back to her seat in a daze. Around her, officers were celebrating their Apache assignments, the positions she'd worked for, the aircraft she'd studied obsessively, the role that would have honored Marcus's memory. She stared at the assignment letter as if it might spontaneously change. It didn't. That evening, she did something she'd never done before in her military career. She went directly to her commanding officer's office without an appointment. Major Henderson was finishing paperwork when she knocked on his open door. He looked up with the expression of a man who'd anticipated this conversation. "Sit down, Mitchell." She remained standing. "Sir, I want to know why I was assigned to transport when I scored highest in the class." Henderson sighed, setting down his pen with deliberate slowness. "This is about the Apache assignment." "Yes, sir, my test scores qualified me. My performance was—" "Your performance was exceptional," Henderson interrupted, his voice carrying no warmth. "That's not the issue here, Captain. Sit down, that's an order." Sarah sat, her back rigid. "Look," Henderson began, leaning back in his chair. "I know this isn't what you wanted, and I know you have every right to be frustrated, but here's the reality. The Apache crews aren't ready for female pilots. The men who fly those aircraft, who work together as teams in combat situations, they've got a culture, a specific dynamic. Adding a woman to that equation creates complications we're not prepared to handle." "With respect, sir, that's discrimination." "That's military readiness," Henderson replied sharply. "Look, I'm trying to do you a favor. The Apache community is brutal. If you go in there without buy-in from the pilots, without the culture accepting you, you'll be treated like an outsider. You'll be sabotaged, subtly but deliberately. Your career will suffer. The Black Hawk community is more progressive. You'll have a better experience there." "I don't want a better experience, sir. I want the aircraft I trained for. I want the assignment I earned." "That's not how this works." "Then how does it work?" Sarah's voice rose slightly. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like the highest-scoring candidate in the class is being denied her assignment based on her gender." Henderson's face hardened. "You want to talk about discrimination? File a formal complaint. But understand this, Captain, you'll make enemies doing that. People will remember. Your career in the Army will become significantly more complicated." It was a threat wrapped in mentorship, a warning disguised as advice. Sarah stood. "Thank you for your time, sir." She walked out of his office into the cooling Alabama evening. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, beautiful in a way that made her want to scream. She found herself walking toward the flight line, drawn by some gravitational pull. The Apache helicopters sat on the tarmac like sleeping predators, their rotors still, their weapons pods silent. She could see herself in that cockpit. She could feel the controls responding to her touch. That night, alone in her quarters, she nearly quit. She drafted an email resigning from the Army, her hands shaking as she typed the words. She read it 3 times. She moved her cursor to the send button. Then she saw Marcus's words again in her journal. "Sarah will fly higher than any of us." She deleted the email. Instead, she opened a new document and began typing, a detailed account of her ground school performance, her test scores, her qualifications. She would file a formal request for reassignment. She would appeal through proper channels. She would document every instance of gender-based discrimination. Major Henderson wanted to threaten her with a complicated career. He had no idea what complicated looked like. Sarah Mitchell was just getting started. Sarah's assignment to the A-60A Black Hawk Squadron was supposed to be a punishment, a consolation prize for a woman who'd stepped out of line. Instead, she transformed it into her proving ground. While her formal appeal for Apache reassignment made its way through military bureaucracy with glacial speed, she threw herself into Black Hawk training with an intensity that made her instructors uncomfortable. She didn't just learn to fly the transport helicopter. She became obsessed with understanding every system, every limitation, every possibility. Her formal appeal was rejected after 6 weeks. The rejection letter was polite, bureaucratic, and absolute. After careful review of Captain Mitchell's qualifications and the operational needs of the Army aviation community, it has been determined that the A-60A assignment best serves the interests of the command at this time. Translation: she wasn't going anywhere. Sarah read the letter twice, then filed it in a folder labeled Motivation. She'd known it was unlikely, but the finality of the rejection stung. That evening, instead of wallowing, she made a decision that would redefine her trajectory. If they wouldn't give her an Apache assignment, she would make herself so indispensable, so undeniably exceptional, that they would have no choice but to give it to her. The first opportunity came 2 weeks later. A routine supply run to Fort Benning had developed complications. A severe thunderstorm was moving through Georgia, and the scheduled pilot requested a weather delay. Sarah was in the flight ops office when she overheard the conversation. Without thinking, she approached Captain Williams, the senior pilot coordinator. "Sir, I can make that run." Williams looked up from his weather maps. "There's a severe thunderstorm warning in effect, Mitchell. The flight's postponed until tomorrow." "The supplies are critical," Sarah said, pulling up the manifest. "Ammunition for the training ranges. The exercises are scheduled for tomorrow morning. If we delay, the entire training schedule gets pushed back." "And if you crash in a thunderstorm, that's worse," Williams replied flatly. "I won't crash, sir." He studied her for a moment, a pilot assessing another pilot's competence. "You have 45 minutes before that storm hits the corridor. If you're going, you go now." "Yes, sir." Sarah was in the air in 30 minutes. The flight was brutal. The thunderstorm came at her like a living enemy, shaking the Black Hawk with violent turbulence. Rain hammered against the canopy so hard she could barely see the instrument panel. Hail pinged against the fuselage like gunfire. Any pilot with sense would have turned back, found an alternate landing zone, admitted defeat. Sarah flew deeper into it. She didn't rely on vision. She flew by instruments, her hands steady on the controls, her mind mapping every updraft and downdraft the radar showed her. The Black Hawk bucked and twisted beneath her, but she flew like she was dancing with the storm, anticipating its moves, staying one step ahead. When she finally broke through the weather and saw the lights of Fort Benning ahead, her flight suit was soaked with sweat. She delivered the ammunition in a downpour and flew back to Rucker without incident. The other pilots heard about it within hours. The woman in transport had flown through a thunderstorm that would have made most pilots request a weather hold. She'd done it deliberately, intentionally flying into danger rather than around it. Respect, grudging and quiet, began to circulate through the Flight Operations Center. Sarah didn't stop there. When a medical evacuation was needed in remote territory, she volunteered. When a pilot needed an extra set of hands for a tricky night landing in unfamiliar terrain, she was there. She volunteered for every dangerous assignment, every complicated flight, every mission that came with real risk. Other pilots began requesting her as a co-pilot not because she was the female captain they felt obligated to support, but because she was reliable, because she wouldn't panic. Because she had a gift for reading aircraft behavior and anticipating problems before they happened. 3 months into her Black Hawk assignment, Sarah had logged more flight hours than pilots with twice her tenure. She'd earned a quiet reputation as someone who didn't just meet standards, she exceeded them, and she did it while asking for nothing in return. Then Captain Derek Johnson came into her life. Derek was a legend in the Apache community. 12 years in, nearly 2,500 flight hours, multiple combat tour, and a reputation for being the best tactical pilot anyone had ever flown with. He was also struggling. For the past 6 months, his Apache had been developing intermittent instrument failures, glitches in the navigation system that couldn't be replicated in maintenance but showed up unpredictably in flight. Mechanics had replaced components, updated software, run every diagnostic available. Nothing worked. Derek was being grounded pending further investigation. An Apache pilot without an aircraft is like a fish without water, purposeless, adrift, slowly losing the thing that defines him. Sarah's name came to Derek's attention through Rodriguez, who mentioned her in passing. "That's the woman who flew through the storm. She knows helicopters like I know my wife. Seriously, she's scary smart." Derek needed an observer for a training flight, someone to watch his instruments while he tested procedures in the air, looking for the failure. He put in a request almost without thinking, just grabbing the next available qualified co-pilot. He didn't expect Sarah Mitchell to show up. She appeared in his ready room 20 minutes before pre-flight, uniform crisp, eyes alert. Derek was a man who'd built his reputation on reading people, and he could see immediately that this was someone who took flying seriously. They did the pre-flight briefing with professional efficiency, and Derek found himself impressed by her questions. She didn't ask for clarification to make conversation. She asked about his specific instruments, his sensor arrangements, his backup systems. She'd done her homework. The flight lasted 2 hours. For 90 minutes, nothing happened. Smooth air, clear skies, the instruments behaving perfectly. Then, as they turned toward the return heading, Derek felt the subtle hesitation in the navigation display. There, gone, there again. He was about to call it out when Sarah's voice came through his headset. "Sir, I'm seeing a lag in your primary navigation system. Secondary nav is compensating, but there's a half-second delay. It's almost imperceptible, but it's there." Derek's eyes widened. The delay was so subtle that most pilots would have missed it entirely. The mechanics certainly had. "You caught that." "I was watching for it. Your hand position on the cyclic was compensating for a system that was giving you slightly incorrect data. Just like when you're driving a car with a wheel that's slightly out of alignment, your hands adjust without thinking." They landed back at Rucker, and Derek made a decision that would change everything. As they were shutting down the aircraft, he turned to Sarah. How would you like to help me figure this out? Really help, not just fly but problem solve. Sarah's heart skipped. I'd like that, sir, more than anything. Good, meet me at the simulator building tomorrow at 1900 hours. Tell nobody. Not about the instrument issues, not about what we're doing. This is just between us. Clear. Crystal clear. As Sarah walked away from the tarmac that evening, she understood something fundamental had shifted. She had entered the Apache pilot community not through official channels or military orders, but through something more powerful, the respect of her peers based purely on demonstrated excellence. The real journey was about to begin. The simulator building after dark had a particular quality, empty, silent, and anonymous. Derek had scheduled it that way deliberately. The Apache simulator was a cavernous room filled with the replica cockpit of the AH-64D, surrounded by screens that could display any terrain, any weather, any combat scenario. It was here, at 1900 hours on a Tuesday evening, that Sarah Mitchell would begin her real education. Derek was already inside when she arrived, wearing civilian clothes instead of his flight suit, a small precaution against drawing attention. He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup, assessing. You understand what we're doing here? I understand the risks, Sarah replied carefully. Do you? Derek set down his cup. If anyone finds out I'm coaching you off the books, my career ends. Not just a reprimand. Done. Finished. 30% retirement instead of full retirement. And you'll be blacklisted. They'll say you seduced me into helping you or that you're somehow cheating the system. The narrative writes itself. Why would you take that risk, sir? Derek walked to the simulator, his hand running along its fuselage. Because I've flown with a lot of pilots, good ones, great ones. I've never flown with anyone who caught the kinds of details you caught on that flight. You have something most pilots take years to develop if they develop it at all. You have an intuition about aircraft. And I watched you in ground school. You scored 99 out of 100 and the system punished you for it. He turned to face her. That's not right. So we're going to fix it, not through official channels, through excellence. They began that night. The first sessions were deceptive in their simplicity. Derek would set up a scenario, a routine transport mission through mountainous terrain, and let Sarah fly it. He didn't instruct, he observed. He watched how she approached problems, how she read her instruments, how she anticipated changes in weather and terrain. After each simulation run, he would pause everything and ask one question. What did you miss? Sarah would review the flight, analyzing every decision, every maneuver, every instrument reading. At first, she found obvious things, a slight inefficiency in her approach angle, a delay in responding to wind shear indicators. But as the weeks progressed, Derek pushed her into scenarios that demanded not just competence but intuition, not just knowledge but instinct. He taught her the Apache's weapon systems through diagrams and technical manuals brought from his quarters in unmarked folders. He walked her through tactical procedures, combat approaches, and the kind of three-dimensional thinking that separated good Apache pilots from the legends. More importantly, he taught her how to think like an attack helicopter pilot, aggressive, decisive, willing to take calculated risks, but always maintaining absolute control. October became November. Their sessions happened 2 or 3 times a week, always at off hours, always with Derek locking the simulator building door behind them. They developed a rhythm, a shorthand. Derek would say canyon run, and Sarah would know to execute high-speed approach to a target in mountainous terrain. He would say compound scenario, and she would prepare for a flight that involved weather, mechanical failures, and hostile contact, all at once. By mid-November, Sarah could execute combat procedures with the kind of fluidity that took most pilots years to achieve. She could fly combat approaches while managing complex weapon systems. She could transition from transport flight to tactical scenarios without hesitation. More importantly, she had internalized the Apache mindset, the aggressive, confident, calculated aggression of an attack pilot. Derek had also discovered something. Sarah didn't just understand the Apache. She improved every scenario he created. She would suggest procedural variations that were more efficient. She would identify tactical problems with solutions Derek hadn't considered. She was teaching him as much as he was teaching her. They were colleagues now, not mentor and student. The discovery came on a Thursday night in late November. Captain Marcus Williams, not their ground school instructor, but a different Williams, a maintenance officer, had left something in the simulator building and came back after hours to retrieve it. He found the door locked and looked through the window. What he saw: two pilots in full concentration, Sarah executing a perfect Apache weapons deployment while Derek coached her through a combat scenario. Williams didn't report it immediately. Instead, he went home and thought about it all night. By Friday morning, he'd made his decision. This was wrong. Not because Sarah was a woman. Williams was one of the few Apache pilots who didn't harbor gender prejudice, but because it violated every regulation about training protocols and proper procedures. He reported it to Major Henderson. Derek received the summons to Henderson's office at 1300 hours on Friday. His hands were steady as he walked through the door, but his mind was already calculating damage control. "Sit down, Captain Johnson," Henderson said, not looking up from his desk. Derek sat. "I have a report that you've been conducting unauthorized training with Captain Mitchell in the Apache simulator, that you've been providing instruction outside of official channels, that you've been violating about 6 different training protocols." Henderson finally looked at him. "Explain yourself." Derek had prepared for this moment. "Sir, I was conducting an evaluation of Captain Mitchell's potential as an Apache candidate." "That's not your job. That's not your authority." "No, sir, but I have the discretion to evaluate pilots who might be valuable to the Apache community. And, sir, Captain Mitchell is the most naturally gifted pilot I've encountered in my career. She's being wasted in transport aviation. The Army is wasting a resource." "That's not your decision to make," Henderson said coldly. "I understand, sir, but I'm making the case to you now. Give me a week. Let her fly a real Apache mission with me. You'll see what I'm talking about." "That's not happening." Derek stood. "Then I'm requesting a formal review of her original assignment. Because, sir, with respect, the only reason she was assigned to transport was institutional bias, not capability assessment. And I don't think the Army can afford to lose that kind of talent based on bias." Henderson's face darkened. "You're playing with fire, Johnson." "Maybe, but I'm playing with fire on behalf of the right cause." Derek was given a formal reprimand and suspended from flight status for 30 days. Sarah received notification that her midnight training sessions were forbidden, and that any further violation would result in discharge from the Army. But something had shifted. Derek's willingness to risk his career for Sarah's potential had caught Colonel Bancroft's attention. Bancroft was not a man who ignored loyalty or conviction. He began asking questions. He reviewed Sarah's ground school performance. He watched flight recordings of her Black Hawk operations. He read incident reports, all of which showed extraordinary competence under pressure. And he started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, Major Henderson had made a mistake. Derek, suspended from flight but not from his post, spent his 30 days of grounded time compiling documentation. Flight records, training assessments, technical evaluations, video recordings of Sarah's simulator work. When his suspension ended, he made an appointment with Colonel Bancroft and walked into the commander's office with a thick folder. "Sir, I want to talk to you about Captain Mitchell," he began. Bancroft gestured for him to proceed. For the next 2 hours, Derek laid out the case, not emotionally but factually. The test scores, the flight records, the technical knowledge, the demonstrated excellence. He showed video of Sarah's simulator performance, of her tactical thinking, of her weapon systems mastery. He presented evidence of institutional resistance that had nothing to do with capability and everything to do with tradition. When Derek finished, Bancroft was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and said something that would echo through the rest of Sarah's career. "You've just made a very compelling argument, and I'm going to do something about it, but I want to do it right. Leave this with me." Derek walked out of the colonel's office knowing he'd just changed the trajectory of two military careers, his own and Sarah's. The endgame was in motion. 3 weeks after Derek's meeting with Colonel Bancroft, Sarah still didn't know that her fate was being decided in closed-door conversations happening above her pay grade. She continued her Black Hawk assignments, flying with quiet competence, never mentioning Derek or the simulator sessions that had been officially prohibited. She'd returned to documenting her daily flight hours, her training achievements, building a personal record of excellence that would outlast any institutional resistance. She didn't know that Colonel Bancroft had made a phone call to Admiral James Morrison, the highest-ranking aviation officer in the Army. She didn't know that Derek had sent video recordings through back channels. She didn't know that her name was being discussed in rooms where strategic decisions about the future of Army aviation were being made. Admiral James Morrison was a legend forged in the crucible of military aviation. 43 years of service, 12,000 flight hours, combat tour in 3 different decades. He'd started flying when the Apache was still being developed and had personally tested some of the earliest prototypes. He was the kind of officer who made career decisions on competence alone, who had no patience for politics or tradition if they conflicted with operational readiness. He was also notoriously difficult to impress. When Colonel Bancroft called requesting an unannounced inspection visit, Morrison had been curious. When Bancroft casually mentioned a pilot assessment that might interest the Admiral, Morrison's interest sharpened to a point. "What kind of assessment?" Morrison had asked. "One that challenges some institutional assumptions," Bancroft replied carefully. "I'd rather you see it firsthand, sir. Draw your own conclusions." So on a Tuesday morning in early December, Admiral Morrison arrived at Fort Rucker without warning. His presence rippled through the base like a shock wave. Officers straightened. Standards tightened. The entire facility shifted into high-alert mode. Everyone knew an unannounced admiral visit meant someone was about to be evaluated, and that someone could be going up or going down. Colonel Bancroft met the admiral on the tarmac, saluted, and guided him toward the Flight Operations Center. "Thank you for coming, sir. I think you'll find this interesting." "I don't appreciate cryptic," Morrison said, his tone sharp. "What am I looking at?" "A pilot assessment, sir. Apache potential. I'd like you to observe a simulator session. Make your own evaluation." They arrived at the simulator building at 9:30 hours. Sarah was already suited up, preparing for a training scenario that Derek had arranged with Colonel Bancroft's approval. She had no idea Admiral Morrison was in the facility. She had no idea that one of the most powerful men in Army aviation was about to watch her fly. Sarah settled into the Apache simulator cockpit, running through her pre-flight checklist with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this 100 times. Derek was her safety observer, monitoring from the control station. Colonel Bancroft and Admiral Morrison stood in the observation booth, separated from the cockpit by thick glass. "What's the scenario?" Morrison asked quietly. "Tactical assault on a compound in mountainous terrain," Bancroft explained. "Hostile contact, weather deterioration, mechanical failure during approach. She won't know about the failures until they happen." Morrison's expression remained neutral. "And this is routine training." "This is advanced training, sir, designed to evaluate decision-making under pressure." The scenario started, and immediately, Admiral Morrison understood why Bancroft had requested this viewing. Sarah flew with a calm aggression that was difficult to quantify but impossible to miss. She approached the target site using terrain masking, flying low and fast, her hands moving across the controls with an economy of motion that suggested years of experience rather than months of training. Then Derek introduced the first complication, a wind shear warning. Sarah adjusted her approach vector smoothly, compensating without hesitation. The terrain appeared on her displays, jagged and threatening. She curved between ridges with millimeter precision, never wavering, never checking her approach speed. Then the weapon systems problem occurred, a radar issue that Derek had programmed in. Sarah recognized the anomaly in her targeting display within seconds. Instead of fighting it, she transitioned to manual targeting, her eyes tracking the compound on her forward-looking infrared display while her hands made minute adjustments to her position. Her weapon's release was textbook perfect. The approach back out became the real test. As Sarah was exiting the engagement area, Derek introduced a hydraulic failure, sudden, unexpected, partial loss of flight control responsiveness on the starboard side. A lesser pilot would have panicked, would have attempted to land immediately, would have lost situational awareness. Sarah felt the change in the aircraft's behavior, assessed it in milliseconds, and adapted her approach to the alternate landing site Derek had previously briefed her on. Morrison leaned forward, his eyes intense. Sarah flew toward the alternate landing zone, her approach angle shallow to account for the compromised flight control. The simulator's visual display showed her descending toward a small clearing surrounded by trees. Most pilots would have aborted, would have attempted to limp back to the main airfield. Sarah committed to the landing, trusting her assessment, executing the most challenging approach in the scenario. The skids touched down soft, the aircraft settled, the engine powered down. For a moment, there was silence in the observation booth. "How long has she been flying?" Admiral Morrison asked quietly. 5 months in the Black Hawk, Bancroft replied. 18 months in the Army aviation pipeline. "That's impossible," Morrison said flatly. "No one acquires that level of proficiency in 18 months. "She did, sir. The question is whether we're going to let institutional bias cost us a pilot at the top 5% of her peer group." Morrison didn't respond immediately. Instead, he continued watching as Sarah powered down the simulator, meticulously went through her post-flight procedures, and unbuckled from the cockpit. She moved with the quiet competence of someone who just executed a complex task flawlessly. No celebration, no relief, just professional completion. Derek emerged from the control station and walked Sarah through her debrief. Morrison watched their interaction, the respect in Derek's body language, the way Sarah carried herself with quiet confidence. This wasn't arrogance. This was earned certainty. "Where is she now?" Morrison asked Bancroft. "Exiting the simulator. She's probably headed back to the flight line for her scheduled Black Hawk mission." Morrison made a decision. "I want to speak with her." "Sir, she doesn't know you were observing." "I'm aware. Take me to her now." They intercepted Sarah on the flight line, walking toward the Black Hawk operations office. She was still in her flight suit, helmet under one arm, completely unaware that her entire military future was about to be rewritten. Colonel Bancroft approached first. "Captain Mitchell, this is Admiral James Morrison. The Admiral would like to speak with you." Sarah's blood froze. She'd heard the rumors about an unannounced inspection. Her mind raced through possible violations, possible mistakes, possible reasons why a 3-star admiral would want to speak with a junior captain in transport aviation. She saluted sharply, "Admiral, ma'am." Morrison regarded her with an expression that was impossible to read. "Walk with me, Captain." They began walking toward the empty flight line, leaving Bancroft and Derek behind. The sun was high and harsh, and Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as Morrison remained silent, his stride measured and deliberate. "You fly the Apache simulator well," Morrison finally said. "Sir, Sarah began, panic rising. "Don't explain," Morrison interrupted. "I want you to understand something, Captain Mitchell. I've spent 40 years evaluating pilots. I've seen the best our military has produced. In those 40 years, I've encountered very few pilots with your level of intuitive understanding of aircraft performance." Sarah didn't know what to say. "The barrier you faced," Morrison continued, "isn't about capability. We both know that now. The barrier has been fear and institutional inertia. Those are problems I can solve." He stopped, turning to face her directly. "As of this moment, you are being reassigned to Apache Squadron. Anyone who has a problem with that answers to me. Understood?" Sarah felt her knees go weak. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." "Thank me by being the best pilot I've already proven you can be," Morrison said. "Dismissed." As Sarah walked back to the flight line, she could hardly believe what had just happened. Everything she'd fought for, everything Derek had risked, everything she'd sacrificed, it had just been handed to her by the most powerful voice in Army aviation. She had her wings. The official announcement of Sarah's reassignment to Apache Squadron came 2 days after her meeting with Admiral Morrison. Colonel Bancroft called a full squadron briefing at 1600 hours, and Sarah sat in the audience section, still wearing her Black Hawk insignia, while the commanding officer addressed the assembled pilots. "As of today, Apache Squadron will be receiving a new pilot," Bancroft announced without preamble. "Captain Sarah Mitchell, transferring from Transport Aviation. I expect everyone in this room to extend her the professional courtesy she deserves. She will be treated with the same standards and expectations as any other pilot. Are we clear?" The room was silent. Sarah could feel the eyes on her, some curious, some skeptical, some openly hostile. She kept her gaze forward, her shoulders back, her expression neutral. This was the moment where the real test would begin. A formal reassignment meant nothing if the squadron rejected her. The culture, the brotherhood, the unspoken code of combat aviation, these couldn't be ordered from above. They had to be earned. Derek was the first to approach her after the briefing. He caught her outside the briefing room, his expression carefully neutral in public, but his eyes bright with barely suppressed triumph. "Welcome to Apache Squadron, Captain," he said formally, extending his hand. They shook hands with the professionalism of two officers greeting each other, but Sarah understood the message beneath. "I told you so. I risked everything and I was right." "Thank you," she replied quietly, "for everything." The first week was brutal. Sarah was assigned as Derek's co-pilot for a routine patrol mission, a relatively simple flight that would let her transition into the Apache with minimal risk. But the other pilots in the squadron watched like hawks. They watched how she entered the cockpit, how she configured the controls, how she managed the systems. They were looking for hesitation, for mistakes, for evidence that this was some kind of social experiment that would end badly. Instead, they watched Sarah execute a perfect pre-flight in half the time it normally took. They watched her configure the weapon systems with the certainty of someone who'd already logged 1,000 flight hours in the aircraft. They watched her take off, transition to the patrol altitude, and fly the mission with the kind of calm proficiency that made it look routine. "She's done this before," one of the younger pilots muttered to another as they reviewed the flight recording afterward. What they didn't know was that she'd done it in simulation, in midnight sessions that had cost Derek his credibility and his suspension. She'd done it in her mind 1,000 times, visualizing every procedure, every contingency, every possible scenario. She'd prepared not just to succeed but to excel. By the end of the first week, Sarah had flown 4 missions. Each one was executed flawlessly. By the end of the second week, pilots were requesting her as a co-pilot, not because she was a woman breaking barriers, but because she was reliable, because she didn't make mistakes, because she had an almost supernatural ability to anticipate problems before they became emergencies. The nickname came from Derek, whispered initially in pilot briefings, "Ghost," because enemies never saw her coming, because her approach angles were so precise they seemed to bend physics, because when she was flying, everything just worked. The nickname spread through the squadron like a virus, but unlike the typical nicknames given to pilots, crude, often insulting, always ironic, This one carried respect. 3 weeks into her reassignment, Sarah's first real combat mission came. A convoy had been ambushed in disputed territory, and Apache support was being requested. The squadron scrambled, and Sarah found herself in full combat loadout, armed with Hellfire missiles and 30mm rounds, flying toward a live-fire situation. This wasn't training. This wasn't simulation. This was the moment where theory became reality and competence became survival. She flew with Derek as pilot in command, with her as weapons officer and tactical coordinator. The flight was tense, the radio chatter urgent, the situation on the ground fluid and dangerous. Their mission was to provide overwatch for the convoy while they extracted to safety. What happened next would be discussed in Apache circles for years. The enemy had set up an ambush with multiple attack positions, and they were using human shields, hostages positioned near the convoy to deter airstrikes. Sarah saw the problem immediately and radioed an alternative. If they shifted their approach vector, they could engage the southern position without risking civilian casualties. Derek trusted her assessment and initiated the maneuver. Sarah's targeting was so precise that she neutralized the threat position with 2 Hellfire missiles, each one threading between buildings in a way that seemed mathematically impossible. The convoy extracted safely. On the flight back to base, the radio chatter was professional, but Sarah could feel the shift. She'd just proven herself in the currency that mattered most in combat aviation. She could make the difference between soldiers living and soldiers dying. Her sex didn't matter. Her background didn't matter. Her formal assignment history didn't matter. What mattered was that she could fly, she could fight, and she could keep people alive. That evening, the entire Apache squadron gathered in the ready room. Major Thomas Chen, the squadron commander, stood and looked directly at Sarah. "Captain Mitchell, that was exceptional work today. Your targeting solutions and tactical assessment prevented casualties on the ground and preserved our combat capability. Welcome to the Apache family." The room erupted in applause, genuine, unreserved applause from pilots who'd initially been skeptical, who'd watched her prove herself every single day, and who now recognized they were flying with someone special. Over the next 2 months, Sarah flew 17 combat missions. She earned commendations. She became the pilot other pilots wanted on their wing. Young soldiers on the ground, infantry units being supported by air assets, began requesting her specifically. The legend of Ghost grew, not as a woman breaking barriers, but as an exceptional pilot who'd earned her place through demonstrated excellence. The institutional barrier hadn't just cracked, it had shattered. But Sarah understood something that others didn't. Breaking the ceiling wasn't about her individual success. It was about opening the sky for everyone who came after. Young women entering the Army, seeing her name on flight rosters, seeing her call sign on combat reports. They would see possibility where others had only seen barriers. She received a letter from a 17-year-old girl in Colorado, written to the Army's Public Affairs Office and forwarded to her. "I saw your name in the news, Captain Mitchell. I'm applying to the Academy next year. I want to fly like you. Thank you for showing me it's possible." Sarah read that letter in her quarters and finally allowed herself to cry, not from weakness, but from understanding the true magnitude of what she'd accomplished. She'd done more than become an exceptional pilot. She'd become a door through which an entire generation could walk. 5 years passed like pages turning in a flight log. Sarah Mitchell went from controversial reassignment to decorated combat veteran. Her service record a testament to what excellence looked like when institutional barriers finally stopped blocking the path. By 2004, she completed 3 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, logged over 2,800 flight hours, and earned the respect of every pilot who'd flown alongside her. But the achievement she was most proud of had nothing to do with her own success. It had everything to do with opening doors for others. Second Lieutenant Alexandra Chen sat in the cramped ready room at Fort Rucker, studying Apache systems diagrams, with the same intensity Sarah had once brought to the same task. Alex was the first of Sarah's proteges, a young pilot who'd applied to Apache Squadron specifically because she'd read about Sarah Mitchell in military publications. She was also the first female pilot in her advanced flight training class, facing the same skepticism, the same subtle resistance, the same institutional doubt that Sarah had confronted years earlier. The thing about the fuel system, Sarah explained, pointing to a diagram, is that it's interconnected in ways that seem redundant until you're in a situation where you need that redundancy. You can't think of it as separate tanks. Think of it as a unified system that's been compartmentalized for safety. When one compartment is compromised, the system roots around it. Alex nodded, making notes. And in combat scenarios, that's what separates pilots who survive problems from pilots who don't survive problems. Exactly, Sarah said. Technical knowledge saves lives, not just yours. Everyone on the ground counting on your support. Alex had been assigned to Apache Squadron 3 weeks earlier, officially through proper channels without the drama and resistance that had defined Sarah's path. But the journey was still hard. There were still pilots who rolled their eyes when she entered briefings. There were still instructors who seemed surprised when she demonstrated competence. The culture had shifted, but it hadn't transformed completely. Sarah understood this. She'd lived it. So she mentored. By 2004, there were 7 female Apache pilots in active service. Sarah had directly mentored 5 of them. She worked with them on weapons systems, on tactical procedures, on the psychological resilience required to fly combat missions knowing that some pilots around you still question your presence. She shared strategies for navigating the still male-dominated culture without becoming brittle or defensive. She taught them that excellence was the only argument that mattered, but that excellence alone sometimes wasn't enough. They had to manage the perception gap as well. "They're going to doubt you," Sarah told Alex during one of their sessions. "No matter how good you are, some of them will always doubt you, so you have to be undeniable. You fly better than the men around you. Not as well, better. You study harder. You train longer. You volunteer for the toughest missions. You make it mathematically impossible for them to claim you don't belong." "That doesn't seem fair," Alex said quietly. "It's not," Sarah replied, "but that's the reality we work within. Fair is a luxury for people who have already won the battle. We're still fighting." The second piece of Sarah's legacy was institutional. Colonel Bancroft had been promoted to general, and one of his primary missions in his new position was modernizing Army aviation's culture around diversity and inclusion. He recruited Sarah to serve on the Women in Aviation Task Force, a committee dedicated to examining barriers to female pilot advancement and recommending systemic changes. Sarah approached it with characteristic intensity. She didn't lobby for special treatment or lowered standards. Instead, she pushed for transparency. She demanded that selection criteria be explicit and objective. She fought for documentation of performance metrics so that decisions couldn't be made on subjective, cultural fit. She insisted that training be standardized so that no one could claim that hidden knowledge was necessary for success. Her testimony before Army aviation leadership in 2003 became historical. "The only barrier between female pilots and their rightful place in this community is the barrier we collectively choose to maintain. Remove the institutionalized doubt, and you'll discover the talent that's been waiting on the other side of it." By 2004, the policy recommendations from her task force had been implemented. Women were being accepted into Apache training at a much higher rate. More importantly, the evaluation criteria had become transparent and objective. Politics mattered less. Excellence mattered more. Sarah's personal life had found unexpected stability as well. She'd met Michael, a Black Hawk pilot, at a squadron function in 2001. He was one of the few men in Army aviation who'd supported female pilots from the beginning, not out of political correctness, but out of professional recognition of competence. They'd married quietly in 2003, and by 2004, Sarah was expecting their first child. Being pregnant while serving as an active combat pilot created its own complications. Some commanders suggested she step back from flight status, take administrative duties during her pregnancy. Sarah refused. She flew until her 8th month, documented every flight, and built a case that pregnancy didn't impair pilot capability. She was making evidence for women who would come after her, building a foundation of precedent. "You're being reckless," Derek told her during one of their coffee meetings, a ritual they'd maintained over the years, staying connected despite their careers diverging. "I'm being strategic," Sarah replied. "Every time I do something that hasn't been done before, I'm creating permission for women who come after. I'm expanding the boundaries of what's possible." "You're also going to become a mother," Derek said. "Don't forget that part." Sarah smiled. "I'm not forgetting, but the mother I want to be is one who showed her daughter that she could do anything she set her mind to." In July 2004, Sarah gave birth to a daughter. She named her Margaret after her mother, but her call sign became inevitable: Little Ghost. The image of Sarah Mitchell, legendary Apache pilot, returning to flight status 5 weeks after childbirth created ripples through the entire Army aviation community. Some saw it as irresponsible. Most recognized it as revolutionary. By 2005, there were 13 female Apache pilots in active service. 2 of them had completed combat tour. 3 more were in advanced training. The pipeline was changing. The institution was transforming, slower than Sarah would have wanted, but genuinely transforming. On a cold November afternoon in 2005, Sarah stood on the flight line with Alexandra Chen, who was now a fully qualified Apache pilot preparing for her first overseas deployment. "You nervous?" Sarah asked. "Terrified," Alex admitted. "What if I'm not good enough?" "You are," Sarah said simply. "I've watched you train. You're better than good enough. You're exceptional. Go over there and be the best version of yourself. Not for the women coming after you, that's too much pressure. Do it because you love flying, because you believe in the mission, because you owe it to the soldiers on the ground." "What about everything else? The politics, the resistance, the people who still don't want us there?" "That's not your problem to solve," Sarah said. "My generation solved that. Now it's your job to just be an excellent pilot. That's the legacy. We made it so that you could just be excellent without having to also be a symbol." Alex nodded, understanding the profound truth beneath the words. The fight wasn't over, but it had fundamentally changed. Sarah had spent years being both pilot and pioneer, both warrior and symbol. Now she was passing that burden to a new generation, but a lighter burden, one that left room for just being a pilot. The ceremony took place on a pristine autumn morning in October 2010, 6 years after Sarah first broke through the Apache community's institutional ceiling. Fort Rucker's parade grounds were filled with officers, enlisted personnel, and families. Hundreds of people gathered to witness a moment that would be remembered in Army aviation history. Sarah Mitchell, promoted to major and decorated with multiple commendations for valor, was being honored for her contributions to aviation excellence and institutional change. But the honor that mattered most came in the form of a young woman stepping forward in dress blues, pinning captain's bars on her uniform. First Lieutenant Natasha Washington had become the first African-American female Apache pilot. She trained under Sarah's mentorship, and now, as she received her captain's rank, she represented something even more profound than Sarah's individual breakthrough. She represented the cumulative effect of one woman's determination to change an entire system. Because of Sarah, Natasha had faced fewer barriers. Because of Sarah, the evaluation criteria were transparent. Because of Sarah, excellence could speak without having to fight institutional prejudice as well. As Washington pinned the bars, Sarah felt tears threaten, but she maintained her military composure. This was the moment she'd been working toward all along, not her own success, but the freedom for others to succeed without carrying the weight of symbolic importance. Admiral James Morrison attended the ceremony, now retired but still commanding respect wherever he went. After the formal proceedings concluded, he sought Sarah out, shaking her hand with the warmth of someone who'd watched a protégé exceed every expectation. "Do you remember what I told you on that runway?" Morrison asked. "That I was the finest pilot you'd ever seen, sir," Sarah replied. "That's what I said, but what I meant was that you were the finest pilot I'd ever seen because you were willing to prove it, repeatedly, undeniably, unquestionably. You didn't just break a ceiling, Mitchell. You rewrote the rules about how ceilings are broken." He paused, his aged eyes still sharp. "That young captain you just watched get promoted. There will be 100 more like her because you insisted that excellence be the only measure that matters." That evening, Sarah sat alone in her quarters with a worn leather journal, the same one she'd kept since childhood, filled with decades of entries, sketches, and dreams. She turned to a page she hadn't read in years, written in Marcus's handwriting when they were both 12 years old. "Sarah will fly higher than any of us. She has the will to do it." She pulled out a pen and wrote beneath his words, "I've flown as high as I can, Marcus, but I've built a sky so vast that the women coming after me will fly higher than I ever dreamed. That's the real victory." The statistics told the story. In 1993, when women were first allowed to fly combat aircraft, there were 0 female Apache pilots. By 2010, there were 47. By 2012, that number would rise to 63. The pipeline was full of women entering flight training, no longer fighting institutional doubt so much as institutional resistance that was weakening with each new success story. Sarah's mentor, Derek Johnson, had retired from the Army in 2008 and was now working with commercial aviation companies. But he stayed connected to Sarah, and they'd meet occasionally for coffee, two warriors who'd fought the same battle from different angles. "You remember when I thought my career was over?" Derek asked during one of their meetings. "When I got suspended for helping you." "You risked everything," Sarah said. "I didn't risk everything," Derek replied. "I invested everything. And the return on that investment is every female pilot flying today who doesn't have to spend 18 months proving basic competence. You changed the equation." By 2010, Sarah had logged 3,200 flight hours, completed 4 combat tours, and trained over 30 female pilots who were now serving in active units around the world. She'd also become the first female major in her aircraft specialty, a promotion that came through formal selection boards based on demonstrated excellence. No special consideration, no political maneuvering, just merit. But perhaps her most important contribution came through the policy work. The Women in Aviation Task Force, which she chaired for 3 years, had produced recommendations that became the foundation for how the Army approached diversity in aviation for the next 2 decades. The recommendations weren't about lowering standards or creating special programs. They were about transparency, objectivity, and removing the hidden barriers that had nothing to do with capability. Her final act before transitioning to a staff position came in 2011, when she was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony of the first all-female Apache pilot class. 5 women who trained together, supported each other, and were entering the community simultaneously. Sarah stood before them in dress blues, decorated with the medals of her service, and spoke words she'd written carefully to capture everything she'd learned. "When I started this journey," she said, "I thought the goal was to prove women could fly Apache. It took me years to understand that the real goal was to make it so that no one would ever have to prove it again. You represent that achievement. You're not here as symbols. You're not here to break barriers. You're here because you're excellent pilots. That's the legacy we've been building, a military where excellence is the only qualification that matters. But understand this, the work isn't finished. There are still places in this institution where bias exists, where assumptions limit opportunity, where tradition masks discrimination. Your job is to fly better than the doubters expect, sure. but it's also to notice those barriers and help dismantle them for the pilots coming after you. That's how we move from individual breakthrough to institutional transformation. The camera footage from that speech circulated through military channels, eventually reaching mainstream media. Sarah Mitchell became a face of military aviation modernization, invited to speak at conferences, quoted in articles about leadership and institutional change. But she remained fundamentally focused on the mission, on flying, on mentoring, on the practical work of making an institution better. In her private moments, Sarah often returned to that leather journal, to the early pages where she'd sketched Apache helicopters in painstaking detail, where she'd written about her brother, where she'd documented the journey from childhood dream to impossible career. She'd fulfilled her promise to Marcus. She hadn't just flown, she'd flown so well that she'd permanently altered the landscape for everyone who came after. She'd transformed a personal victory into a systemic change. She'd taken institutional resistance and turned it into institutional momentum. On quiet mornings before dawn, when she was preparing for a flight, Sarah would sometimes stand on the tarmac and look at the Apache lined up against the rising sun. She thought about the girl in Colorado who'd written her a letter saying she wanted to fly. She thought about Alexandra Chen, now a captain with her own mentees. She thought about Natasha Washington, breaking through yet another barrier. She thought about the ones coming next, the pipeline filling with excellence. And she thought about Marcus, somewhere among those clouds, finally seeing his twin sister fly. The legacy wasn't about one woman's success. It was about an entire generation gaining the freedom to be excellent without having to be symbolic first. It was about a military institution that had learned that the best pilots don't come from a single demographic. They come from anywhere talent and determination intersect with opportunity. Captain Sarah Mitchell had done more than break a ceiling. She'd shattered it into 1,000 pieces and used those pieces to build a bridge for everyone who came after. That was the real victory. That was the legacy forged.